The recent government guidelines given to schools to keep our classrooms a safer place during the COVID crisis has for many made behaviour management slightly more challenging. If you're finding it harder to keep on top of low-level disruption since this all began, then keep watching. Because in this film, I'm going to give you my top tips and techniques for managing low-level disruption in this socially distanced classroom. For those of you who are new to my channel, I'm Lisa Miller and I'm an education consultant specialising in behaviour management. If you don't want to miss the tips and techniques that I post on my channel, make sure you subscribe or share the link if you think a colleague might find this film useful. Now, before we begin, it's important to recognise that there are regional variations in the restrictions that have been brought in. For example, some counties have made the wearing of face coverings for staff mandatory and others haven't. One thing's for sure though, our learners have missed a significant amount of schooling and they're having to get used to new routines and protocols. Also, our strategies are going to have to adapt as our circumstances change. Bearing all that in mind, let's have a look at some of the strategies that I'm going to suggest. Number one, with everything that's going on, it's more important than ever that we rigorously address the usual causes of off-task behaviour. So try the following. Share your learning goals very, very clearly. It's important you sell the lesson and your learners understand why they're there, what they're going to be learning, what they've learnt, and what they're going to take away from the session that they didn't know before. Remember, they can only be motivated by progress if they know they're making it. Praise the process. Give plenty of reassuring feedback and skills-based praise. It's really important that they enjoy the learning process without the fear of failure. Don't give them too long on any individual task. Remember, the general rule of thumb is the more challenging the group, the shorter the bursts of on-task time. That way you reduce the risk of them getting bored, distracted and wandering off task. And finally, always check for understanding before you set them off on task. That way you reduce the likelihood of a sea of hands popping up that you'll then have to address once you've got them started. Number two, you're going to be introducing, reiterating and reminding your learners of lots of rules this term. So to do that without sounding naggy or confrontational, use championing. Championing is where you use the needs of the group and them as individuals as the rationale behind giving instructions, or if you have to reprimand somebody for not doing something that you've asked them to do. I'll give you an example. Okay folks, I want you to listen carefully. I don't want you to miss out because someone else is talking. Championing, if used well, shows the group that you're protecting their rights as opposed to being confrontational, and it creates a nice protective feel about your classroom. Number three, several of you have said that you're finding it much harder to keep on top of noise levels and prevent calling out because either your movement is restricted because you're teaching from behind a shield or your children are placed in zones. Now, there are many things you can do to help prevent your noise levels from rising. Firstly, be very clear about what you expect to see and hear and identify quickly by name those who are doing exactly what you want. Reduce their incentive to chat by giving them very clear time limits and counting them down with countdowns and cue-ins to those deadlines. Three-part instructions are great for doing that. For example, finish your sentence, put your pen down and look up so I know we're ready to start. Give them pace and time markers to give them a sense of purposeful momentum. Now, a pace marker is where you say, by now you should be, and a time marker is where you say at 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock, we're going to be stopping. That really does reduce the amount of off-task time because you're very clear about where they should be at which point. Even if you've checked for understanding before you set them on task, you're still likely to have to give extra support. So try live typing prompts and suggestions on your interactive whiteboard instead of talking across the room. That way your voice doesn't become the reason that the noise level starts to rise again. And finally, to prevent calling out, make sure you are incredibly consistent about telling them how you want them to respond to you. So make sure you give them a condition for answer every time you ask them a question. For example, hands up, who would like to share your answer with the group? Now you can even develop a series of signs and symbols that can be easily understood from a distance. For example, this can show them that you want them all to answer together as a class. This can tell them that you want them to be mouth closed and put their hands up. And this can tell them that you'd like them to put their hands down because you're going to go to them by name. Now, those teachers who are incredibly consistent about this have far less calling out. Number 4. Now, many of you are having to wear facial coverings in the classroom, and that obviously prohibits your ability to use facial expressions as a behaviour management tool. Now, that means you're going to have to work extra especially hard on your tonal range and voice modulation in order to compensate for that. Don't forget, you need to have 3 distinct tones of voice that give information to your learners. Your instructional voice must be animated and place emphasis on key words. Your praise voice must be genuinely enthusiastic and go hand in hand with eye contact, so you give the receiver maximum attention. And your reprimand voice should be flatter and neutral in tone, using shorter statements as opposed to questions, so you lessen the attention that you're giving. And lastly, number 5, try to create reassuring routines for all the new procedures that you're going to introduce into your classrooms. Now, many schools have restricted group work and prohibited practical work altogether, so there are going to be a whole raft of new protocols to follow. Be realistic about how you police safety procedures. Be patient and calm. Remember, we want them to follow and comply, but we don't want them to be afraid. So I hope you found this film useful. These strategies develop and complement strategies that I explore in my other films. So if you haven't watched any of those yet, go and take a look at my playlist. If you don't want to miss the tips and techniques that I share on my channel, then don't forget to subscribe or share the link if you think a colleague might find this film useful. Take care and stay safe.